Perfect. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sri Krishnamurthy from Quant University. I hope you're having a wonderful spring so far, and we are excited to kick off the Quant University Spring School 2026. And we've planned a series of events for you over the next month and a half or so to tell you more about what's actually happening in the agentic AI side of things in the financial services world. I just wrapped up teaching two courses, one for Northeastern University and another at George Mason University. And I finished a couple of executive education courses, and I had a lot of interactions with uh, professionals who've been trying to apply agentic AI and large language models and various tools in their workplace. So it's always nice to kind of see practical use cases on how people are trying to do different things. On the other side, I've had a battalion of students who are excited to learn all these technologies and who are kind of being relieved of the drudgery of coding applications from scratch and are left and right using credits to build out applications using Claude and ChatGPT and Gemini and all these other tools. So we have a whole force of people who are excited about experimenting with agentic AI and related technologies, and they're building out agentic stacks. And I'll tell you some of the projects we had been working on in the course as we go. But the focus of this series of workshops we are hosting is primarily what is happening in the area of agentic AI in financial services, and how do we think about the hype on what's all possible, but it costs a lot of tokens, and we don't have the guarantees of what we should be seeing with respect to applications. And then what are the architectures which are evolving, and then the risk associated aspect. So this series of lectures and workshops we are going to be hosting over the next month and a half or so. You're all welcome to attend it. There is no charge to attend any of these events. The first three events are primarily focused on giving you the landscape on what's actually happening. And I'm going to kick off today's session with an introductory lecture on what agentic AI in finance actually means. And we will kind of, give you a little bit of the lay of the land on what's happening and what are the kinds of technologies which are out there and what are the various design best practices. I don't have any kind of magic tool stack, which I could say, well, you use this and every problem of yours will be solved. As most of you know, these are all technologies which we wouldn't even dream of a few years ago. And we are now using these as though these are a part of our tool chain forever. So I'm also learning like you all. So most of the things I'm going to be talking about are things which I've been learning and I've been practicing. And sometimes it's always a challenge on expectations versus reality. My daughter had a swim meet yesterday, and it was at MIT's swimming pool. And I thought, like, from 6 to, well, it was like 4 to 7, I'm just going to be doing nothing. So let me vibe code an application. And it was 7 o'clock, and my first draft of the application was still not complete. And my Claude was still complaining that these things are not possible, certain things weren't done right. How about I start from scratch? So 3 hours, $200 worth of credits just went into waste, and we are kind of restarting from scratch. So that's kind of the fact of the world. I hope you guys are bestowed with enough number of credits within your organizations or with the budgets you have to experiment with things, because right now a lot of it is experimenting and learning and adopting what works for you. So hopefully this first session will kind of give you the lay of the land of what's actually happening in the agentic AI side of things. And then my good friend and collaborator, Agus Sugianto, who headed model risk at Wells Fargo, has been working on a huge framework on how do we think about agentic AI and how do we think about validating some of the agentic AI. So he and I, we had a couple of discussions. Agus and I, we have known each other for a long time, and we keep collaborating on various things. And Agus has graciously accepted my invitation to virtually join us on May the 1st and the 7th to do a series of lectures, primarily putting together a blueprint on what does governed agentic AI look like. And the timing is critical at this point, especially in financial services. Most people who've been tracking the regulatory landscape in financial services are aware that the OCC SR 11.7 is now being superseded by SR 26.2, and there's been a lot of discussion online about what does that mean. There is an explicit statement which says that generative AI and agentic AI has been excluded from the scope of SR 26.2. And what does it mean? It means that more responsibility for the organization to do the due diligence, because it's no longer just a checkbox. So it means that you have to think about your idiosyncratic risks and what level of risk you can take with respect to the applications you're building, which means that you have more responsibility to figure out what needs to be done, which means that the more you are thinking about expanding the scope of generative AI, the more you have to also embed risk and make sure that all the things which you thought were taken care of needs to be factored in as you're designing and developing your applications. So hopefully we will have those discussions over the next few weeks to kind of understand like what does it mean to build out agentic architectures and govern them. And on May 14th, if you are in the Boston area, I'd love to welcome you all to our offices in Mass Challenge, which is in the Seaport District. And between 5:30 and 7:30, we are hosting an Agentic AI roundtable. We're keeping it invite only just to make sure that we have the right people in the room. We will be inviting a lot of financial services professionals who are in leadership positions, trying to build out the landscape of what does it mean to adopt AI technologies within their organizations. So we will have a discussion. It's going to be close-knit. We will try to see what parts of it could be live streamed, but the goal is to think about building out a roadmap. And we are at Quant University setting up an AI leadership risk council. So we would want to have engagement from people in the industry who are building out these frameworks and practicing various aspects and are wanting to share their best practices, but also learn from other practitioners. So we're trying to put together a leadership council. If any of you are interested in or in working in similar roles, please reach out to me. I'd love to see if we can get you engaged in various ways. We are trying to form various subgroups so that we can build out those frameworks and white papers so that we can think about knowledge sharing. As you know, Quant University, we have been big into education, both on the professional side and also on the academic side. We don't have an academic research wing. We don't do a lot of theoretical papers. What we think about is, well, how can this be applied in practice? And me going back as a quant 20 plus years now, it's just that there are so many things which could be done. It's just a question of whether it's the right technology for the right job, and that needs context. And we as professionals have that context working in the industry. So we have to take everything which comes as a new flavor of technology in this world with a pinch of salt, and we want to make sure that it's applicable to our particular use cases. So that's the whole goal of building out this roundtable. And then finally, on May 27th, we are hosting trying to invite fintechs and corporations which are interested in leveraging these technologies. And we are building out a workshop, a 4-hour workshop. So there's going to be a little bit of education on how to build out MVPs. The goal is, with respect to building out agentic AI applications, we don't have waterfall models anymore. We don't think of it as a 6-month project. Agents and with tools we have, we can prototype an application within half a day and see whether it actually makes sense. And that culture of rapid prototyping, rapid iteration, building out applications to specifications are things which we need to learn. And if we are not comfortable building out those kinds of artifacts and trying to get a feel for the product, it's going to be hard for us to innovate in the future. So we are trying to figure out like what's the best way to build out specifications and making sure that whatever we build are kind of things which could be applied in the financial industry, but also checking out new technologies when there are so many new cool technologies coming out, what's the best way to iterate and work towards it. So that's kind of the goal of the fifth workshop. So all the workshop invites are through qagenticai.base44.app. So you can go in and register, and we will hopefully see you there in this workshop, and obviously this workshop, but also hopefully in the next few series of workshops. So that's kind of the introduction for this workshop series. And without further ado, I'm going to go and talk a little bit about what does it mean to work through applications in the agentic AI in the financial services world. Now, this came out as an invited lecture I gave at MIT in January, and I've updated this a little bit. So the goal was, the quest for an AI quant, because as you know, we as quants and financial professionals in the industry have multiple hats. If as a CFA charter holder, you're kind of understanding the various kinds of financial instruments which are out there, the various practices based on the asset classes, based on the kind of entity we are working on. On the technology side of things, there's a lot of data which is available. There are a lot of data vendors who are providing different kinds of data sets which we need to integrate and factor that in. Obviously, the fiduciary responsibility, the policies and procedures internally needs to be followed because we are working in a regulated industry, and I would consider this as a mission critical industry. And then we have these innovative technologies which are knocking our doors. We have a lot of new technologies which are coming in over the last few years, and we want to basically try to build the various aspects as we are building out our workflows. So most of the efforts we have been having over the last 10 to 15 years or so with all these new technologies were we as human integrators building out these stacks, trying to see how best we can integrate these technologies and build out workflows. Now we are seeing the true emergence of potentially delegating what we as humans were doing to agents. We are now trusting these agents to be able to deliver upon our requests, to independently take decisions, to kind of automate research workflows, to do the kinds of things we as human experts were doing on an ongoing basis. So it kind of brings out different opportunities and concerns. So that the whole goal of this lecture is to kind of give you a flavor for what I'm kind of seeing, the way the world is going, and then invoke some discussion. So I'm going to try and see if we can save the last 10 to 15 minutes for question and answers, and we can go from there. And someone asked a question about the slides. Yes, you will have access to all these slides, and also have a couple of demos, which I'm not sure if we can show, but we'll try to see if we can build out demos and show some demos over the next few weeks. But I will be making all these available if you're signed up through Q-Skill Bridge, including Augustus lectures, so that you'll have all the lectures and all the educational content in one place. So you will have access to it. So please, watch your emails for the recording lectures. Okay, so one thing I want to kind of set the stage is, like many of the things I'm talking about, I'm not going to reference any papers or frameworks or specific GitHub repos kind of a thing. I want to keep it as high level as possible. In today's session and in the future sessions, we'll try to go deep. But my goal for today is for you to sit back, relax, and think about where we are and where we hope to be, and what are the possibilities to get there, and what are the obstacles we have to plan for as we get there. Now, many of you have been watching the news. Agentic AI is the buzzword of the day, if you will. But what has also happened is people are realizing that it's no longer just a piece of technology. The McKinsey CEO was raising his concerns about, like, well, what does the workforce look like? And he was saying that, well, our firm will have 60,000 employees, but many of them are responsibilities which we have delegated to agents. 25,000 of them were AI agents. So last year, I gave a talk at the Milken Institute, the Ebri Milken Institute, and the nationwide CTO was there sharing the panel with me. And he was mentioning that for his workforce, many of the technologies are now given a team of agents. And they have a force who's kind of monitoring and also doing performance reviews on these agents. So many of these agents are expected to work at a particular capacity, supporting the humans. And if they're not doing their job, the agents could get fired, the agents could get promoted to do other additional things. So they're kind of treating these agents as though they would treat humans in the sense that they were trying to build out capabilities which are going to be collaborative in nature in some ways, potentially replacing humans in other ways, potentially also delegating, and then seeing the evolution from just being an assistant to potentially autonomously doing certain kinds of decisions. So we are seeing a lot of experiments in the field. And if you've been tracking the software stocks the last few months, and also the surge in the AI infrastructure and the AI stocks, people are realizing that the industry, the software industry and the tech industry is also changing significantly because of all these innovations. And we as consumers of many of these technology products in the financial industry will have to think about like how will our industry change over time as these new products come into fruition. So a couple of things I want to kind of see if we can cover in today's next 30 minutes or so. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. I want to just acknowledge the challenges we have in the financial industry as we are building out our products. And I want to give a little bit of an introduction to what agents actually are and what they are not, and what are the kinds of architectures we need to think about as we are building out our agentic ecosystem. And I'll try to give you a few examples on where agents could be used. And maybe these are ideations which you could potentially take. I mean, frankly, if you have Claude Code or Codex, you could probably take these ideas and just code up an agent and then try and do an experiment on your own without much of a technology background yourselves. But you have to think about if you are going beyond just the experimentation stage, what all will be needed as you're building out your infrastructure. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of things I did and I learned by structuring an experiment over 16 weeks at my university, and affiliation, and how we kind of build out a whole private equity intelligence system over 4 months, which I would say 20 years ago would probably take more than 50 people and close to a year's worth of work to actually just get the technology piece right, not even kind of factoring in all the other pieces and integrations which were out there. Okay, so that's kind of the plan for today. A couple of things to note. Many of these discussions we have been having are, there are no shortcuts. You have to think as an engineer, you have to think in the context of systems. There are a lot of engineering pieces which needs to be fully assimilated before you can even design some of these systems. You probably have seen all these memes and cartoons and LinkedIn posts, if you will, people going and vibe coding a web app and saying, hey, even knowing no code, I was able to like code up a website, and here's my local host, 8080, you can check it out there, kind of a thing, right? So if you don't really understand the underlying technologies, it's going to be hard for you to think about both the value proposition and also the engineering aspects of it. So I think in terms of moving from just prototyping towards deployment, you have to understand the mechanisms. The key aspect is how do we govern all these aspects and building out things, and also the value aspect of it. Because yesterday I spent a few hours, I've spent a couple of $100 on tokens, didn't get anything done. But if you are building out a scalable system which is heavily reliant on LLMs, what does it mean, and what is the cost aspects, and how much of it is the development, design, verification, testing, and all those pieces, but also when you deploy it, what parts of it needs to be factored in as you're building it out. So those are things you have to consider. Now, a couple of things we have to understand. I mean, obviously, these were terms which would be completely Greek or Latin for me even a few years ago. But we all started out with prompting, right? When ChatGPT came out, we started writing experiments. And I would tell my students that, hey, you shouldn't be writing code from scratch. You should just build out a function signature and maybe ask ChatGPT to give me the stub code or the classes, and then you can integrate it. And then it went into like workflows wherein we could say, oh, you know what? I don't need to be able to do everything on a start from scratch basis or a greenfield basis. I could basically have my context stored. I could have certain artifacts I could design and build out my templates and then design my workflows because these are the things I expect to be repeatable. And that's exactly what I did. In fact, the slide deck you're seeing was completely generated by my system, wherein I had my templates, my fonts, my sizes, my boxes, my LaTeX, my generation of PDF, all predefined as a workflow, and I could only focus on the content piece because the workflow would take care of the formatting and the generation of the various artifacts. In fact, many of the software applications I built out for demos for both my training in the professional world, but also for my academic classes are now being generated by many of the toolings following the workflow pattern because I'm able to now abstract out the commonalities of what I do on a repeatable basis and then define that as a workflow and then focus on the key things which I do creatively and then embed them and provide the required context so I can design those workflows. And now we are kind of generalizing all these aspects into agents because now we are not only able to like take these workflow and put them together, but now we can make it adaptive. So now, as you know, many of the LLMs which are coming out there, they have planning and reasoning capabilities. You now have access to tools. In the past, if you asked ChatGPT to solve a partial differential equation, most likely you were not able to get good results. But now you could basically build an MCP server. You could potentially connect it to a mathematical modeling tool and then send your equation across the wire and get the equation solved and back the results and then consolidate it, right? So you are now able to build out an ecosystem wherein you can create these adaptive workflows and think about the plan and the potential ways in which a goal could be accomplished, especially when you're potentially leveraging information from the web, wanting to use certain tools in the workplace or online, and then try and assimilate it. Guess what? That's what we do in the financial industry. We have a ton of databases which we are going to be soliciting for research purposes. We have established workflows. We want certain things to be deterministically done. We want certain things to be adaptive as we learn certain things and then figure out, oh, this is probably not the right model, and then this other process could be followed. So the way we could evolve could be something which we could potentially delegate it to agents. So the key idea here is, we want to make sure that as we are seeing these evolution from prompting to decision systems, we want to make sure that we want to see that these products are reproducible, reusable, and attributable. Then a couple of things which we all know in the financial services world. When you start, you know that your data, you have issues of non-stationarity, feedback loops, incentives wherein someone's making money, arbitrage opportunities, regulation. We all been hearing about, the prediction markets and how things are evolving there. And then we have to think about the attribution aspects, the profit and loss and other things. So we have a very strict ecosystem of rules and protocols and actors in the marketplace, and we want to make sure that we are adhering to the rules of the game and also making sure that we are trying to leverage those opportunities. So it's not just a mathematical accuracy wherein we got the equation right. Does the equation actually lead to a decision, a financial decision, which is responsible, which is attributable, and which is something, an organization could look up to and say, okay, this is the right thing we did as we accomplished our task. So that's something we have to think about as we are building out. And it's not as easy as saying, oh, we got something right. It's something which, if it goes wrong, it could potentially affect our reputation and could be catastrophic for the company. That needs to be factored in. But the other part, which we also have to think about, is because finance is such a complicated area. I mean, when I came into the financial services world from the engineering world, it was kind of a mind shift because in the engineering sense, we had the physics to rely on, and we knew what was possible, and we knew what we could attain as a goal through scientific experiments. And we could say, okay, so you engineer this right. If it's reproducible and tested, now we can deploy it on the field. And then there are going to be factors for deterioration. But that part is something which is natural as things evolve. So can we design systems and then put together failure and life and associated aspects of it? But in the financial services world, things are constantly changing. The data is constantly changing. We have to have models which can work with certain kinds of data sets. Potentially, models are also constantly changing. We sometimes don't even know how to validate it. In fact, if I talk about validation of agentic AI systems, we are talking very much conceptual at this point. We have some evals, we have observability, we have some tools which are there, but actually creating policies for validation, we are not there yet, right? And then there's the narrative, right? How are we going to take the value proposition of what we are building, wherein there are multi-step workflows and planning and all these tools integrated, and how are we kind of delegating those decision-making capabilities to these workflows, and what kinds of actions are expected, and how is it reproducible, and what aspects of risk have we factored in. So all those needs to be factored in, right? So we have to start thinking about well, how can we surgically start looking at where we could potentially start using these applications? Now, I would call them as two parts. One is the implicit part and the explicit part. The implicit part is something we have already been doing. I mean, I've not seen a single student of mine or practitioner when I go in saying that tools something I don't use at all, even if they are going to be kind of checking summarization, maybe even writing some code, looking at large documents and trying to extract information out of it, maybe helping with decision making. So all those are implicit decision making tools. And there's a lot of value in it. It used to be the case wherein these tools were not trustable, but we now have the capabilities, at least with the newer models, that we can get information from these tools to a point where we can actually use the outputs of these in a professional capacity, right? And then the explicit part comes in, wherein think of Erica from Bank of America. It's a chat bot wherein you can go and ask about account information. And there's this whole notion of hyper-personalization coming in, wherein the context is already known, your account information, the way you're coming in and the way you interact with a particular system. So you have these tools which enable you for a better experience as you're working with the interfaces. And then there's automation capabilities. Gone are the days when we would take our checks and go to a bank and deposit and wait and get a risk for it. Today, you can just take a phone and take a picture of a check, and then the OCR kicks in, and you have pipelines which goes in and kind of does its thing, and then your accounts get updated on an ongoing basis. So we have a lot of explicit use cases, and we are still just scratching the surface. There are going to be a lot more use cases. In fact, people are talking about, at least in the education side, you have seen a lot of personal tutors. You could potentially customize educational materials. For professionals, maybe it could be the same thing, wherein if a novice associate comes in, and this novice associate is getting into private equity, and the knowledge gap is there, but there could be a private tutor for this associate who mentors the associate on the rules of the game, the policies and the procedures, providing them the feedback, providing them the resources they need, which potentially may not be possible by a human mentor. So there are a lot of new innovative use cases kind of coming in. Let's kind of just summarize the financial workflows into 4 buckets just for introductory purposes. Obviously, there are a lot more use cases which we can think about. The first one I call is as knowledge synthesis, because we are really good at creating knowledge in the financial industry, right? So we have research reports, we have analysis, we basically can consolidate pieces of information from regulatory filings, and we can think about strategy memos, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of stuff is hosted within our firewalls, and most of this information is not available on the web. And most LLMs are really good with generic information which has been scraped from the internet, but are not really good for professional questions or information associated with maybe regulatory memos and other memos we have internally. So that's where knowledge synthesis is a great application, because now you can build in workflows which are catering to the use cases within an organization, building upon the knowledge bank within the organization. Then there is the whole notion of trust and authentication, because as we know, because if you've been tracking the news, the new Claude Mythos, there's been a significant scare about what could it do when it gets released to the industry and what are the possible repercussions. It's so easy to generate fake profiles and fake emails, fake transactions. Organizations are going to get overwhelmed. And many of these transactions, many of the costs to make sure that the data coming in is real, it adds to the cost of a particular transaction. So how are we going to think about workflows wherein we could potentially factor many of these becomes a big value proposition, because it's going to be extremely expensive to have humans going and do all the factoring of the trust and authentication pieces. And then there's the conversational intelligence, because most of the interactions we've been dealing with are written communications or information which has been printed. But now you have voice, there's a communication happening between a customer service representative and a frustrated end user. Could we sense sentiments? Could we understand certain kinds of inflection points potentially to enhance the service experience, or also to see whether the service could be done in a better way? And if we are going to be delegating that interaction capabilities to agents, and the agent is doing the talking, the agent is taking the decisions on behalf of humans, how do we bestow those responsibilities to agents? So there's a lot of tooling, and there's a lot of things which needs to be factored in, but there's also aspects of privacy and things which needs to be considered, because an agent should not be revealing information to a customer. It should not be doing certain things. And then obviously the data governance, because we want to be able to track all the things we are doing. We don't want decisions to be bestowed to agents and the agent just does it. And even if it does it right, if we don't have a way of proving things, it becomes a big nightmare if something bad happens. So all the things we are designing for is to ensure that we have the lineage, we know the rules, we know what parts of the models were validated, and we responsibly deploy and govern these models. So with those in mind, here are some use cases, if you will. I'm just going to try and keep it brief, because I know we are going to run out of time in a bit. But again, we are going to be launching a series of workshops in the future wherein we'll delve deeper into it. But today, as an introductory lecture, I just want you to be excited about the field. There are a lot of new technologies. I don't want to go into individual ones. Obviously, RAG is a big one. But the whole notion is we are thinking about if we want information and we don't have traditional search engines which could do the job, how can we leverage things like RAG and potentially use that to get contextual information so that analysts could enhance their productivity and also the quality of information building as they generate more queries. It all comes in this whole bucket of things, what is called as context engineering, because when we ask a question, many a times the question is, if you read it in isolation, may not give the right piece of information for an LLM or for an intelligent agent to give back an answer. But if I could append it with certain context, then there is enough information for an agent to factor the context and the question and then give a better answer. So the whole notion of generative knowledge is to figure out how do we do context engineering with all the information we have. That way we can get better answers. Another part is the whole goal of trust, fraud detection, et cetera. We are going to be seeing novel risks. We know certain things which are already out there, and we want to be able to factor those as we are building out our classifiers, building out our systems. But if we are going to be delegating things to an agent, we have to think about like, well, how do we think about false positives? How do we think about auditability? So there are a lot of problems we haven't even thought about. I think there's a lot of things which needs to be done to even figure out how much of trust can be bestowed to some of these agents. So some of these workflows would be to go in with, it basically is a parallel track, if you will. So if I'm going to be creating a workflow to build out my trust workflow, that could potentially be a tool an agent could use to figure out whether I can trust the output of a particular system before I can start making decisions. And the third one, as I mentioned, was conversational intelligence, wherein we have to factor in privacy. I do not want to give any kinds of information which is not pertaining to that particular user. There are a lot of technologies involved in here, especially when it comes down to multilingual kinds of queries, potentially also using automatic speech recognition, making sure that any red flags are immediately tracked and flagged, but also maintaining the audits and the logs. So a lot of things which needs to be put together as we are building out these workflows. And then finally, I think this is an area, the governance area is frankly very, very, I would say, novel in terms of what we could potentially establish as a best practice. In fact, if you read the SR 26.2, it explicitly says that agentic AI and generative AI are not covered as a part of the whole memo which came out. So which means that it's left for us as practitioners to think about like what level of risk we should be able to take and build out the right kinds of use cases so that we can track those decisions, because ultimately we own the responsibility of whether the product works or not, right? And then also one of the things to note is the complexity picture. As many of these terms in here, some of you who are in the technology world could potentially look at it and appreciate it. But for practitioners now, it's kind of going beyond the realm of the desktop tools we have been using. So now we're thinking about sandboxes. We're thinking about agents which are using different kinds of tools. So there's the permission issues. There are multi-agent systems, agents talking to each other before making a decision. And then you have code interpreters running. You're generating code on the fly and you're executing code on the fly. Imagine when you think about creating a report, it's not just consolidating text information and presenting it in a PDF format. There are a lot of things that needs to be done. You may have to generate a graph on the fly. Maybe you have to call a Pythonic tool to invoke a library so that you can take the data and generate a particular graph, embed that graph appropriately. So there's a lot of interactions happening. So the ecosystem is significantly evolving. And it means that the brittle pipelines we used to build in the past, those are going to be a thing of the past, because the agent should be able to dynamically look up tools saying, I want to be able to build a graph. I'm in the Python world. I need to be able to pass in this data and get back this particular thing. Which particular tools or which particular packages can do that for me? Figure out which particular service will let that provide that service and use that service to create those artifacts, right? And this is something, you can compare the amount of hair I had 25 years ago with what I have now. But I found it amusing because way back in my graduate studies 25 years ago, my topic was building agentic systems. And at that point, agents were mostly conceptual and in papers, and there was no large language models. But I was thinking about designing a system wherein we had user agents and function agents, wherein users could ask about different functions, and then there would be an oracle, which I called an oracle, but right now it's an LLM, wherein I could potentially use different function agents and then access different databases, extract pieces of information, put them together, and build out an intelligent system for distributed information access. It was published in the Journal of Manufacturing because the use case we looked at was how do we think about leveraging data from sensors and various systems to think about decision making. But it's kind of all coming together because now we can leverage agents and leverage oracles to actually do things, which is what companies like Manus are doing. So people who have been tracking what's happening today, I believe it was in the news. Now, I believe China is blocking the purchase of Manus by Meta. for a $2 billion acquisition because they don't want the technology to be kind of spilling across the pond, if you will, on the other side. But if anybody has used this tool called Manus, if you haven't, you should try it, because when you ask a question, and this is a question I kind of provided, asked it to provide the Tesla report, and it actually generated this beautiful dashboard for me. But more than the actual visual specifics in here, I was able to see what it was doing behind the scenes. So it was actually building out sandboxes. It was invoking libraries. It was using matplotlib. It was building out those graphs. It was leveraging data from different places and crafting this entire dashboard. Now just imagine how much time this report would have taken if I had to do the whole thing manually, even with just a tool like Excel. It probably would be taking at least a few days for me to, first of all, consolidate the information, make it presentable, build out the draft, and kind of build it out. And this was took me less than a minute to actually generate a graph like this. So this is the kind of speed at which Agentic AI is kind of providing the ability to do different things. And that's where I think we are going to see the death of rule-based systems, especially when it comes down to brittle use cases, because now you have tooling and systems which could potentially replace it with much more flexibility. And the notion of we have to do everything as a waterfall model, it'll take us 6 months to build out the static logic, and we can only get a graph of a particular format. So that whole workflow is going to die. I know we're going to run out of time in a bit. I want to save some time for questions, but I'm just going to keep this high level. So I want to talk about some of the kinds of things which are evolving, and we'll talk more in the next few weeks. I'm going to have in a discussion forum when I have our goes next week joining us. We'll talk more about it. But I want to kind of give you the preview of the world, which are still concepts at this point, but these will be operationalized as tools in the near future. Things like planning, wherein if I wanted to build out a portfolio optimization problem, well, there are so many decisions I have to take. I have to think about the kind of equation, the kind of solver, the kinds of constraints, the turnover constraints, the policies which I need to enforce, and what are the restrictions I need to have. I cannot maybe short certain stocks, or I cannot buy a part of a stock. I have to have a whole number. I have to factor in transaction costs. There are so many decisions I need to think about and plan out as I'm building out my portfolio optimization problem. So what in case there's an agent which could factor all those things and build those for you and give you the equations and for you to validate it, right? So that's where the planning stage is going in, wherein you can break your goals into multiple actionable steps, and you could basically see the decision-making process. The second one is the tool use. If you've been using data systems, any kind of data integrators, all the major data providers are now providing you MCP interfaces, API interfaces for you to be able to get the data. And you were doing it when you were building out applications. You would call an API, you would pass in your key and get back the information and do things for your analysis. But guess what? Now agents will be doing the same thing. You will have agents wherein they need the market data. If they're running a back test and they need data for a particular time frame in the past, it can go in, call your favorite or the one wherein you have provided the required keys, go into the database, get back the data, execute upon it, and provide you the results. You don't have to do all those integrations manually. Then there's this notion of memory, wherein you don't have to kind of keep track of certain things. You may have to explicitly provide context in certain ways, but then you could also make sure that there is memory built in. That way, you don't have to redo certain kinds of tasks. Maybe you may have to build upon what you have already done in your past analysis, maybe step back and do other things. So all those are possible with this aspects of memory. And then there's the reflection, which is the self-critique, wherein this notion of an LLM as a judge, which is a design pattern which a lot of people talk about, which is to say, hey, go and do certain things, then clear your design hat. Do not think about you as the designer of what you just did. Go back and with a clean slate, critique the work. Think about how it could be improvised, and then use the feedback to enhance the process, right? So this is like you would probably do in a peer mode, wherein you do certain work and maybe share it with your manager, and your manager says, okay, why don't you change certain things? And then you come back and you implement it. But here you have a process which can improve upon itself. Well, it could not get certain kinds of data sets. What proxies can it use? Where else can it go and get the data? Right? So you could potentially have this notion of reflection inbuilt into your agents, and you can design it in such a way that you could basically take number of trials. You can say, try it 4 times, maybe improvise it 4 times. The fourth iteration may be much better than the first iteration. And again, it's a hypothesis. It may not always work, but it's a process you could potentially try. And then there's the notion of collaboration. Now you can have subject matter experts, and some things you may build internally. You could have an internal policy state agent, wherein a policy agent could potentially say, hey, you can do this, you cannot do this, you should not be able to do this. By rules in Massachusetts, you should not be able to do this. So you can potentially build in those kinds of collaborative aspects wherein certain agents could solicit advice from other agents on what can and cannot be done. And using that, you could build out these specialist agents. And then there could be a whole marketplace of agents. Maybe you're not building out all these agents. Maybe there is a provider who provides an agent for you with the requisite skills, who's keeping out an eye for all the potential regulations or marketplace aspects which you may be interested in. And then you just make a call saying that, I plan to do X, Y, Z. Is that okay to be deployed in this particular environment? And your regulatory agent may give you that feedback, right? So you can build out these kinds of capabilities. And when I share the slide deck, you may see more, and feel free to reach out to me. I'll kind of share additional details if you're interested in, but I just thought I'll give you a little bit of a big picture idea of what's actually happening. And then there are these design patterns which are coming up. And these are, again, if you've done software programming, there used to be the Gang of Four design patterns, where there's a whole book on how you can build object-oriented programming in software engineering. But we are now kind of seeing this whole notion of agentic AI patterns emerging. One is like a planner executor, wherein you may use a very sophisticated Opus 4.7 model for planning out a particular task and use a sonnet or a haiku model for executing certain tasks. So if I wanted to take a design and then convert it into LaTeX code, I don't need a very thinking or a very sophisticated model to it. So maybe an agent which could potentially use or maybe even a local model or a cheaper model to do certain things. So you could delegate different tasks for different kinds of agents. And then there's the hierarchical aspect, wherein there is a supervisory agent who could potentially delegate tasks to different specialists, saying that, hey, this is something I want to give it to a trading agent. This is something I would want to give to a validator agent. So you could potentially delegate a whole workflow to various specialists. And there could be this notion of recursion. We use a lot of recursive aspects when we are generating code. When we generate the code, we say, okay, here's the stub. Let's go generate the code for it. I need you to do X, Y, Z. I also need you to write unit tests to do X, Y, Z. And then when I generate the code, I run the unit tests. It runs the code and says, oh, it did not work. This did not work. These are the problems happen. Say, okay, why don't you go fix this problem, build those unit tests again, run those tests again, and see whether it works. So I can run it with n number of iterations and hope that those bugs will get fixed, or the ones which come in as most complicated bugs which the agents could resolve, that could be delegated to a human in the loop, so that the human can come in and fix only those critical bugs which were not being solvable by agents. And then this notion of self-healing, wherein, oh, I tried to hit an API and I got a timeout, or maybe the service was down, or I hit my rate limit, so I'm going to slow down, wait, and then retry. Or I tried certain things and did not work well. Maybe I'll try a different approach. So those are kinds of things you could potentially incorporate. So there are all these use cases kind of coming in. Obviously, we don't have a gold standard to say that these are all the things you should be doing. But the notion is you are able to build out these capabilities in an ongoing way, wherein practitioners are sharing these best practices, but you got to think about contextualizing it and making it available in financial services. So I have some more slides on that, but I don't think we'll have the time to cover all these other aspects. I know we are going to run out of time, so I'm going to give you like two high-level agents we built to just kind of illustrate it. I'm going to run another workshop wherein we'll talk more about this. And this one is the FOMC research agent, wherein Our goal was to turn transcripts, FOMC transcripts, into tradable, auditable macro signals. Again, these are primarily, I use it as illustrative use cases for teaching professionals how to build agents, but also some of the value which conceptually may make sense, but when you operationalize it, may have different takeaways. And then inputs would be statements, minutes, press Q&A, history, and the outputs would be like themes, tones, surprises, confidence, and citations. And you want to make sure that whenever you build a signal using this agent, you're factoring various things and it's auditable, and you kind of design the whole thing. So this is kind of the architecture on how you would potentially build it. You have a vector database wherein you have minutes from prior meetings. So if Jerome Powell has made certain statements over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's all in the archive, so you can basically compare tones for his current way of expressing certain opinions to how he has expressed opinions in the past for various things. So you could potentially do those deltas, the tone deltas, and think about incorporating that as a decision-making process. So that's kind of an idea. And I have some aspects on how to potentially build it. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to discuss anything one-on-one or want to understand a little more. Another one, and there are like various kinds of specialist agents, which is run through for a quick, research agent, a trading strategy generation agent, a model risk validation agent, a portfolio management agent, if you will. So that's where I think you had to think about like what level of interaction should be done by humans and what level of interactions should be delegated to agents and what that collaboration is going to look like. I don't think we'll have a time for a case study. I have to wrap up in a minute. I know we have kind of blocked time till 1 o'clock today, but happy to share the slides, and I think that's gonna give you some more food for thought on the kinds of things you could potentially do with agents. I just want to end with like a couple of things before we adjourn for today. One, we are still scratching the surface with all we could potentially do with agents. And I'm super excited. 25 years ago, as a grad student, I was kind of thinking, well, these are all concepts which, if it comes to reality, this would be super cool. I did not have the opportunity to operationalize it 25 years ago. The closest I had was when I joined Citigroup, and I was building trading agents, which were competing with human traders. So we could go in to look at Yieldbook and Bloomberg and potentially build out a value proposition for a trade, and it was for munis. So the time was not a big concern, but it was mostly information agents which could collect different things and try to build out a trade and compare that trade with human agents. But now we have the whole possibility. And what we did at Northeastern, where I taught a graduate course in the last 14 weeks, was basically built out a whole architecture to build out a private equity portfolio intelligence system. And I was kind of fascinated because if I had to do this in a professional capacity in an organization, it would probably take me at least 50 people over a year to build out the whole thing. And these were just graduate students who were taking a weekly, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go this week, build a pipeline so I can go in and scrape data from Edgar and then build out certain things. This time, I'm going to go and get job signals and talent data from various websites and build out certain things. This time, I'm just going to integrate all those and create a Snowflake database. This time, I'm going to go and integrate it with LLMs and build out a RAG. I'm going to like encapsulate certain things and build out an MCP server, then leverage LangGraph and build out a multi-agent orchestration, build out dashboards so that I can show all that work. So we kind of, walk students to build out the whole, I conceived the whole framework, I conceived the whole pieces, but in another setting, I will show you the kinds of things we did. And the productivity aspect, it was more than 10x. Each student with their limited amount of knowledge about the industry, but the access to tools with the access to various things could go 10x. Just imagine where we would be if we could be 10x more productive. And the idea is that humans are not going to be replaced by agents. We are going to be orchestrators. We are going to be folks who are going to leverage these agents to the best knowledge. And the delta is if we stick with our ways, we will be replaced by another agent which can do our work. So the thought now is like, how do we evolve as humans so that we can understand these systems better and evolve ourselves as orchestrators and builders of the workflows so that we can engineer these systems and take advantage of all these technologies. With that said, I want you to be excited like I am to join the rest of the series of the workshops. I know in the next few weeks, there are a lot of things happening, but I would really, really encourage you to attend these workshops to at least get a feel for what's happening, and join the discussion, and hopefully it'll enhance your knowledge base and also provide some context as you are trying to operationalize some of these within your organizations.